I remember that evening with the sort of clarity that visits a man, not because the moment mattered then, but because it came to matter later, when memory began rearranging its drawers and left that particular image on top. I had been walking across Radcliffe Square just after dusk, my coat collar turned up more out of habit than need. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, but the stones still held its cool breath, and the lamps cast their pale coronas in the lingering damp. It was the kind of Oxford evening that made a man feel prematurely nostalgic for it. She crossed the square ahead of me, moving with an oddly deliberate grace, as though she had rehearsed each step. A long black gown, formal, old-fashioned, almost ceremonial, swept behind her in measured folds. I noticed, absurdly, that the hem didn't quite touch the ground. I couldn't see her face. She kept it lowered, angled away from me. But something in the posture struck me as familiar, the way a half-forgotten line of verse sometimes presses against the edge of one's mind without revealing itself. Lewis was beside me, muttering something about dinner arrangements, though the words hardly registered. I only remember answering him with the sort of absent civility one uses when one's thoughts are walking somewhere else. By the time we reached the far side of the square, the woman had already turned the corner toward Brasenose Lane. When I followed the line of her movement, she was simply no longer there. Oxford can do that. Swallow a figure in a blink, fold it into the architecture like a pressed flower. I would have dismissed it, perhaps even forgotten her entirely, had it not been for the newspaper I picked up later that evening. I'd chosen a quiet corner of the turf, a place dim enough to keep a man company without asking for conversation. My pint tasted faintly metallic, though that might have been my mood rather than the beer. On page 3, beneath an advertisement for second-hand bicycles, was a small notice: the sudden death of Dr. Imogen Vale, Fellow of St. Crispens College, specialist in medieval hymnography. Collapsed during choir rehearsals, the report said. Unexpected. Unexplained. No suspicion of foul play. It was that last phrase that always irritates me. No suspicion. As though suspicion were a measurable liquid, something poured into a vial and declared either sufficient or absent. I found myself reading her name again, tasting the odd music of it. Imogen Vale, a name that belonged in a footnote of some forgotten canticle. Lewis found me there, half hidden in the back corner. He said something about the football scores, though I scarcely recall them. What I do recall is the way the lamplight caught the grain of the newspaper page, turning the obituary column into something almost fragile. I kept thinking of the gown I had seen, its slow sweep across the stones. It would have been easy, embarrassingly easy, to connect the two images, but even I had enough restraint not to indulge in superstition. Still, there was a small unease at the back of my mind, the kind of mental pebble one feels in a shoe but chooses not to remove just yet. I turned the page, skimmed an article about a library renovation, and paused only because a crossword clue had been circled by some earlier patron. It read, "Cloaked singer holds truth. 5. I could see the setter's intention immediately. Voice hidden inside a word, suggestive of disguise. Veil would have fit, coincidentally, though the number of letters didn't agree. Even so, the coincidence lingered, faint and irritating. When I left the pub, the air had cooled. The square lay empty now, the lamps steady. I walked the same path she had taken earlier, following the memory of her footfalls. I told myself it was idle curiosity, nothing more. But the truth is that the image of her gown, its peculiar length, its restrained movement, had already begun to trouble me. Not because it meant anything, not yet, but because it felt like a detail my mind was unwilling to misplace. Looking back now, I think that was the first moment I understood something was wrong. Not the death, not the gown, not even the coincidence of timing. It was the silence of the square itself, as though the stones had been watching too and had chosen, for their own inscrutable reasons, not to speak. I've always felt that certain colleges in Oxford seem to hum at a different frequency, as though their stones remember a sadness the rest of us have forgotten. St. Crispens was one of those places. Even before Lewis and I passed through the gate, I felt the faint dissonance that clings to neglected architecture and unspoken history. The drizzle from the night before had settled into the flagstones, giving the courtyard a sheen that caught the weak morning light in a way that made everything look slightly out of tune with itself. Lewis commented on the cold, though what he meant, I think, was discomfort. He never quite trusted small colleges. They strike him as secretive by design. I told him something about their charm, though I doubt my tone convinced either of us. The truth was simpler. I wanted to see the place where Dr. Imogen Vale had spent her final hours, to see if it felt as hollow as the obituary made her death seem. The master received us in a study that smelled of old paper and polished wood. I remember thinking that the bookcases were arranged too neatly, the spines aligned with a precision that suggested more performance than use. He spoke with the slow cadence of a man accustomed to deference. "A tragic loss," he said. "Unexpected." She collapsed during choir rehearsal. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. It was the nothingness that bothered me. While he talked, my attention drifted to the hymn book on his desk. Its pages were marked in several places, but one corner had been folded twice. An unnecessary gesture, as though someone had wanted to ensure the crease would not unfold. I asked him about it in a tone meant to seem casual. He looked at it only briefly before claiming it must have belonged to Vale. Yet something in the moment, perhaps his too quick glance, perhaps the faint tightening around his eyes, suggested a small lie, the sort people tell not to deceive but to protect themselves from the discomfort of knowing. Lewis asked the usual questions: her health, her temperament, her recent work. The master offered answers that hovered politely above the truth. Vale had been quiet, dedicated, a bit solitary. She preferred the company of manuscripts to people. She had no known enemies. She had some disagreements with the bursar, but nothing one would call a dispute. I let him talk until his words began circling themselves. Then I asked to see the choir room. We walked through the cloister, where the wind carried a faint scent of damp stone and old hymnals. The corridor floorboards gave a soft groan with each step, as though the building were mildly inconvenienced by our presence. The choir room itself was larger than I expected, with rows of chairs still slightly angled from the previous evening. A music stand lay toppled near the back wall, although no one seemed eager to acknowledge it. I moved to the piano, touching one of the keys lightly. The note rang out, a modest, plaintive sound that echoed for a moment longer than it should have. Lewis remarked that the place felt strange. I agreed, though not aloud. It was then that I noticed the photograph on the wall. Dr. Vale, younger and less withdrawn, wearing a robe startlingly similar to the gown I had seen in Radcliffe Square. The fabric had the same solemn flow, the same understated severity. The connection should have felt tenuous, yet it settled into my mind with quiet insistence. A college porter entered the room briefly to collect some sheet music. He avoided meeting my eyes, the way people do when they fear their casual observations might accidentally matter. He mentioned, almost reluctantly, that Dr. Vale had not looked well the past few weeks. Tired, distracted, thinner than usual. But he said it in a way that suggested he had only realized these things after the fact, when hindsight had begun rearranging his memories. On the way out, I paused by the dog-eared hymn book again. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him it was nothing, but the truth was that the double-folded page felt deliberate, almost insistent, as though someone had wanted to draw attention to a single moment Vale had been contemplating. I opened it briefly. The hymn was about the burden of hidden voices, mourning robes, a sudden collapse. Nothing connected, not yet, but I felt the faint vibration of something beginning to resonate, like the low note of an organ warming before it reveals its full sound. And St. Crispens, with all its quiet dissonance, seemed to be holding its breath. If St. Crispens had felt muted the previous day, the choir room that morning felt like a space that had forgotten its purpose. Music rooms ought to carry echoes, faint ghosts of practice scales and half-sung notes. This one held only silence, a silence compressed by worry and the kind of collective unease people try to carry behind their ribs. Lewis walked a step behind me, his boots tapping a steady rhythm on the old boards, while I moved more slowly, letting the air tell me what it remembered. Evelyn Sorrell, the choir director, greeted us with a practiced warmth that never reached her eyes. She stood at the edge of the conductor's dais, fingers resting lightly on the rail, as though needing the contact to hold herself steady. She spoke of Dr. Vale with a gentleness that felt rehearsed. Vale had been brilliant, she said, dedicated, overly meticulous perhaps, but scholars often were. Her phrasing carried the crisp precision of someone who was painfully aware of how her words might sound once repeated. Lewis asked when she had last seen Vale. Sorrell's gaze flicked to the tall windows, the morning light catching her glasses. She said they had finished the rehearsal early, that Vale had seemed tired, that she had encouraged her to rest. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just fatigue. But there was a pause, small, nearly invisible, between her saying tired and her saying encouraged, a gap where truth should have fit more comfortably. Mark Leland, a tenor whose self-assurance entered the room a moment before he did, joined us soon after. He smiled too easily, the sort of smile men wear when they sense tragedy but do not wish to soil their shoes with its weight. He recalled Vale lingering after the rehearsal, scribbling on a sheet of music, muttering something under her breath. She had not seemed ill, he said, merely distracted. When pressed, he added that Vale had been working on something unusual, a comparison of medieval hymns across several obscure manuscripts. He said this with the air of someone who did not understand the work but enjoyed the illusion of intimacy it provided. Caroline Pym, the bursar, arrived last. Her expression was neutral to the point of opacity. She insisted any disputes between her and Dr. Vale were minor administrative matters. There were always disagreements about budgets, especially with scholars who valued manuscripts more than heating bills. Her tone never shifted, but her hands tightened around the folder she carried, as though the papers inside required guarding. While they spoke, my attention moved toward the far corner of the room where several music stands leaned against the wall. One of them bore faint traces of chalk dust, a residue that did not match the others. Chalk is an old habit left from older choirs. St. Crispens had switched to pencils years ago, yet the dust seemed fresh enough to have been disturbed recently. I made a small note of it, though I did not yet know why it mattered. Lewis attempted to tie their accounts together, but the narratives refused to align. Sorrell claimed Vale left early. Leland insisted she stayed late. Pym said she passed through the corridor at the usual time, though her use of usual seemed curiously careful, as though she were declaring normality rather than recalling it. It was then that I asked if they had a recording of the rehearsal. Many choirs did, often for review or correction. Sorrell hesitated, then admitted she kept one on her small cassette device, an older model with a hiss that distorted the softer harmonies. She retrieved it from her desk, and we listened on the spot, the grainy sound filling the room like a memory played through fog. The choir began steadily enough, sopranos carrying the melody, the basses grounding it. Then, near the final chord, I heard it, a faint extra breath, a presence close to the microphone, not part of the choir, not where any singer should have been. A quick inhalation, almost startled, swallowed immediately by the harmony. Lewis didn't hear it at first. When I replayed the fragment, slowing it with my thumb on the worn button, he caught it, though he dismissed it as ambient noise. But I knew the shape of human breath, the quiet intake of someone standing too near a device not meant for them. A person listening when they should have been participating, or hiding when they should have been seen. I asked Sorrel who had been closest to the recorder. She said no one. The machine sat behind her, untouched during rehearsal. And yet, there it was, a breath that did not belong to music. When the tape clicked off, the silence returned. Heavier now, the shadows in the room seemed to gather in the corners, waiting. I felt then that the choir had sung more than notes that night. They had sung around something or someone they had not acknowledged. And whatever had stood near that recorder had left only the echo of a breath as its signature. There are moments in an investigation when the important thing is not what is missing, but the manner in which it has been removed. Dr. Vale's belongings arrived at the station in 2 cardboard boxes, the sort once used for archive transfers. Lewis carried them in with that mixture of duty and mild dread he always displayed when the dead left behind too much paper. He said something about scholars accumulating clutter the way other people accumulate regrets. I didn't tell him the distinction often escaped me. I opened the first box slowly. There was a faint smell of old vellum and lavender, the latter almost certainly from a sachet tucked between her manuscripts. The effect was oddly intimate, as though I had stepped into someone else's memory without permission. Her handwriting, precise, angular, faintly impatient, covered nearly every surviving scrap. Notes in Latin, cross-references to hymns, fragments of translations that faded into abrupt endings. One sheet stood out, a hymn translation with careful annotations running down the margins. The final stanza was missing, cleanly torn away. Not ripped, in haste, torn with the quiet deliberation of a person removing a truth she wasn't ready to share. I traced the edge with my thumb and felt the faint indentation where the paper had been pressed before tearing. Whoever removed it had taken their time. Lewis observed that perhaps the page had simply been lost. I said perhaps, though the word sat on my tongue like a false chord. Vale was not careless. A woman who could annotate a medieval choir's use of modal transitions was unlikely to misplace her final stanza. Among her papers was a notebook, the cover frayed, the spine softened like something often opened but rarely closed with conviction. Inside, I found marginalia beside a line from an obscure hymn. The voice cloaked in mourning. The phrase carried an uneasy resonance, the sort that reached backward toward meanings I hadn't yet uncovered. I wondered if Vale had chosen the words for their poetry or their confession. An unsigned letter lay at the bottom of the box, crumpled slightly along the edges. It was the kind of note academics sometimes send when they wish to wound without implicating themselves, couched in collegial language, sharpened with concealed accusation. The writer warned of errors in Vale's recent work, advising her to reconsider her position before embarrassing the college. The tone was polite, but its temperature was wrong. Too cold, too measured, as though the writer had distilled all sincerity out of it before committing ink to paper. Lewis asked whether I wished it sent to handwriting analysis. I told him no. The point was not who wrote it, but why it had been thrown away rather than filed. Vale had kept nearly everything else. This letter she had discarded. Not ignored, discarded. A small slip of paper fell from the notebook when I closed it. I recognized the shape before I saw the content. A crossword clue, neatly clipped from a newspaper. Vale had circled it in blue ink. The clue read, "Ending withheld reveals truth. 4. I whispered the possible answers to myself. Vale, hide, omit. But one solution clung more tightly than the rest. Clue. A simple word, yet in her context it felt more like a signal. Vale had withheld something. A stanza, a truth, perhaps both. By late afternoon, the light in the office shifted into that particular shade of gray that makes even familiar objects appear half absent. I sat with the torn hymn page for several minutes, letting the silence settle until it felt weighted. I kept trying to imagine Vale's final thoughts as she wrote the missing lines. The incomplete hymn felt like a confession interrupted, or a warning unfinished. Lewis said he was heading to St. Crispens to ask a few more questions. I nodded without looking up. My attention remained on the torn edge, the delicate fibers still visible. A page removed so carefully was not an accident. It was a decision, and in that decision, I sensed the faint outline of something Vale had tried, perhaps failed to protect. A truth, written once, withheld once, and now waiting for someone stubborn enough to read its absence. There are certain moments in a case when the past begins to lean forward, trying to tap a man on the shoulder. I felt that tap on the evening I returned to Radcliffe Square, following the same path where I had seen the woman in the black gown. The sky held the color of pewter, and the street lamps had not yet decided whether to commit their light to the falling dusk. Lewis said he wasn't sure what I expected to find. I told him nothing, but I returned all the same. The square was almost entirely empty. A pair of students hurried past, heads bowed against the cold. A cyclist wobbled toward Cat Street, muttering to himself about deadlines. The rest was silence, the kind only Oxford manages, the kind that feels curated by centuries. I stood beneath the lamp where I had first seen her, trying to reconstruct her movement, the slow glide, the turned face, the measured steps. A memory is never a reliable witness, but sometimes its distortions reveal more than accuracy ever could. Lewis suggested we check nearby shops for CCTV. I agreed mostly to indulge him, though I doubted the cameras would catch the intangible unease that had accompanied her. To my mild surprise, a shopkeeper near the Bodleian entrance produced footage. Grainy, flickering, recorded at a frame rate that made every motion seem slightly haunted. Yet there she was, a figure in a long gown, walking with the same unsettling deliberation I remembered. The recording showed her turning toward Brasenose Lane. Then, in the very next frame, she was simply not there. No doorway opened. No alley swallowed her. She vanished in exactly 11 frames, as though the city had closed over her like water. Lewis blamed an obstructed angle. I let him. But the disappearance felt too clean, too immediate, like an unanswered question folded into the city's breath. We checked the small hotel tucked beside the square, the sort of place preferred by visiting academics who disliked the sterility of chain lodging. The receptionist, a woman with the polite indifference of someone accustomed to eccentric guests, recalled a woman checking in 2 nights earlier. She said the gown was impossible to forget. Far too formal for the creaking staircase and dim carpets. The guest had signed under a name that now seemed almost mocking in its simplicity. Anne Gray. No address, no phone number. Paid in cash. Stayed only 1 night. I asked if anything else seemed unusual. She thought for a moment, then mentioned a small oddity. The guest had written a crossword clue in the margin of the register. The receptionist had ignored it as academic eccentricity, but when she turned the register toward me, I felt the faint tremor of recognition. The clue read, Gown Pota Voice, Truth. The letters were written in a poised, deliberate hand, the same angularity I'd seen in Dr. Vale's notes. Lewis said it might be coincidence. But coincidence in Oxford tended to behave like a polite lie. Presentable on the surface, deceptive underneath. I walked back toward the square alone, leaving Lewis to gather identification details. The evening had deepened into that cold hour when lamps begin to acquire small halos. I kept seeing the gown's hem, the way it hovered above the stones. Vale's photograph in the choir room had shown a robe of almost identical cut. The gown in the square had moved like memory. Not attire. I knew better than to tell Lewis that I felt I had seen Vale herself, a dead woman walking through a square I happened to cross at the exact same moment. I'm not a man given to the supernatural, but grief, whether personal or collective, can make the living echo the dead in ways we struggle to articulate. As I passed beneath the archway leading back toward Broad Street, a gust of wind caught the loose corner of a discarded newspaper, flipping it open long enough to reveal a headline about academic funding disputes. The article mentioned St. Crispens in passing, a single line about financial restructuring. Something in the phrasing tugged at me, a reference to discrepancies in archival budgets. The kind of discrepancies a bursar might prefer to obscure. The kind a meticulous scholar like Vale might have uncovered. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into my coat. The city around me felt suddenly watchful, as though waiting to see whether I would grasp the pattern beneath its surface. The woman in the gown had vanished, but her meaning, whatever it was, had not. And I had the growing, uncomfortable sense that I had mistaken an omen for a memory, and a memory for a warning. It has always struck me that lies rarely announce themselves with grandeur. They slip instead into the quiet corners of routine, hiding behind habits so familiar that one hardly thinks to question them. That was the feeling I carried as Lewis and I returned to St. Crispens the following morning. The air held the smell of wet stone, the sort of muted cold that made the cloisters feel like they had been carved from hesitation itself. The porter let us into the choir room with the weary courtesy of someone who had learned to expect more questions than answers from the police. He gestured vaguely toward the chairs, the music stands, the piano, all of it precisely as we had left it. Yet something in the arrangement unsettled me. Not because it was different, but because it was too much the same, as though the room were staging its own innocence. Lewis began interviewing students who had attended the rehearsal. I moved among them with slow steps, listening less to their words than to the cadence of their recollection. Memory is a treacherous guide. It shapes itself into whatever a person needs it to be. I've learned that truth emerges not from the content of what people say, but from the small tremors they fail to conceal. Two students, a soprano and a baritone, insisted Vale had stayed late after the rehearsal, long after most had left. Vale looked pale, the soprano said, almost translucent in the lamplight. She had been humming something, not quite the hymn they were practicing, something older, darker. The baritone added that someone else had been in the corridor afterward. He couldn't say who. Just a silhouette. A robe, perhaps, or merely a long coat. His uncertainty said more than his memory. When I asked Evelyn Sorrell about Vale's departure, she repeated her earlier claim. Vale had left early. A brief wave, a polite good night, nothing more. She delivered the words smoothly, but her hand tightened around the conductor's baton she held, as though she needed the object to anchor herself. Leland, the tenor with a careless charm, adjusted his scarf before speaking, a gesture too poised to be unconscious. He told us Vale had been troubled about her notes, that she had mentioned an error in one of her translations, though she had not explained further. He said this with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, but his eyes flicked toward Sorrell as he spoke. A glance waited with something unsaid. Caroline Pym arrived later than the others. She apologized in a tone remarkably free of remorse. She claimed to have seen Vale only briefly that evening, passing her in the corridor. She had been carrying financial documents, she said. Urgent paperwork, the kind she never trusted her assistant to handle. But the way she held her folder now, too close, too defensive, suggested she had practiced the explanation. I asked if she had heard anything unusual during the rehearsal. She shook her head slowly, a gesture meant to appear thoughtful. Yet the rhythm of it was wrong, too evenly paced, like someone following internal choreography. Lewis noticed my silence and asked whether I had observed something. I told him only that the room felt dishonest. It was not a deduction, merely an instinct, the sort that rises from a dozen small irritations accumulating like dust. After the interviews, I asked Sorrell to play the rehearsal tape again. She obliged reluctantly, as though fearing the music might reveal what her words had not. The fragile hiss of the cassette returned, the voices rising in imperfect harmony. I listened with the same patience I used when studying crosswords, waiting for the grid to betray its structure. There it was again, the stray breath at the end of the chord, but this time I heard something else. A faint rustle, almost imperceptible, like fabric brushing wood. The sound carried a heaviness not suited to choir robes. Something weightier, a coat or a gown. Lewis claimed the noise was the cassette mechanism. But I rewound the tape, slowing it until the notes stretched thin. The rustle repeated itself. Not mechanical, human. A rehearsal should reflect order, yet this one held dissonance, a presence that did not belong, a listener standing where no listener should have been. When Sorrel reached to turn off the tape, her fingers trembled. Not dramatically, not enough for Lewis to catch. Just a subtle tremor, like a chord played half a beat too soon. I watched her carefully. She avoided my gaze with the skill of someone who had spent years refining the art. As we prepared to leave, I asked who had positioned the recorder during the session. Sorrel answered too quickly. She had. Always her. And yet her description of its placement did not align with the microphone's angle captured on the tape. A small discrepancy, easily dismissed, yet it settled into my mind with the weight of significance. The choir had sung its truth. The rehearsal had lied. And someone in that room had relied on the music to drown the sound of their presence. There is a particular quiet that settles over Oxford in the late afternoon. A quiet I've always associated with the turning of pages in libraries. Soft, decisive, tinged with dust. That was the kind of quiet I felt as I walked through the archives of St. Crispens with Lewis trailing a step behind me. The college librarian, a man whose spectacles seemed permanently smudged with resignation, had unlocked the reading room for us and retreated with the air of someone who preferred not to witness whatever truth we might disturb. I'd asked for older college photographs, the sort taken decades before digital clarity stripped the past of its fog. The librarian produced a stack of them, bound with twine, the edges curled like dried leaves. I untied the bundle and sifted through the images, each one capturing a version of St. Crispens that looked both familiar and foreign, as though the college had once possessed a confidence it no longer remembered. It didn't take long to find her. Imogen Vale stood in the second row of a choir ensemble, younger, sharper around the eyes, her robe hanging with a severity that made her seem slightly misplaced among her peers. Beside her stood Evelyn Sorrel, hair darker than, gaze more direct. And near them, almost crowding the edge of the frame, was Mark Leland, leaning in with the careless intimacy of youth. Caroline Pym appeared at the end of the row, her expression unreadable even then, as though already rehearsing the art of emotional economy. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, whispering that they looked like any group of academics forced into a photograph they didn't want. I told him perhaps, though the symmetry of their arrangement troubled me. They stood close, not with affection, but with the closeness of people bound by something they no longer discussed, or perhaps never had. What struck me most was Vale's posture. She stood slightly angled away from Sorrel, her hands clasped not with modesty but with caution. I recognized the stance from interviews with musicians who guarded their compositions fiercely. Vale had been a scholar of hymns, but every scholar is also a kind of composer, arranging truth into lines that others will later attempt to decipher. Lewis suggested we search for more context. The librarian, hearing this from across the room, sighed as though surrendering to inevitability and retrieved a box of student magazines. I flipped through them, scanning for references to St. Crispin's choir. A short article mentioned a minor scandal years ago, a disputed translation attributed to the choir director at the time. The details were vague, as though the matter had been quietly dismissed, but it named Vale as the student who had raised the initial concern. Lewis asked whether that meant friction between them, so I said friction was too small a word. Scholarship is a polite battlefield. Wounds inflicted there tend to linger. As we prepared to leave the archives, a narrow slip of parchment fell from between two magazines. At first I thought it belonged to the librarian's collection, but the handwriting, spidery, meticulous, matched Vale's notes. A transcription of a medieval hymn. Beneath the third stanza, she had written a line of commentary. History repeats itself only for those who refuse to listen. Lewis remarked that the line felt dramatic. I found it neither dramatic nor mysterious, only weary. A scholar who studies the past inevitably becomes fluent in recurrence. Outside the reading room, the floorboards of the corridor creaked with the disapproval of centuries. A draught moved through the cloister, carrying the faint smell of damp stone and candle wax. I told Lewis I wanted to walk the route Vale had taken on the night she died. We followed the path from the choir room, through the narrow passageway, past the nondescript door that led to the bursar's office. The door frame bore a faint indentation, as though someone had leaned against it recently, perhaps in anger or hesitation, or both. The wood held no answers, of course, but it carried the ghost of a gesture. Vale had confronted someone. That much felt certain. Lewis asked what, specifically, I thought Vale had discovered. I told him I didn't know yet. But as I looked back toward the cloister, I felt the weight of the photograph in my coat pocket, pressing against the fabric like a reminder. Past perfect. Present tense. Old wounds wearing new clothes. And somewhere in that quiet grammar of the past, someone had misused a line, intentionally, violently, and perhaps fatally. There is a peculiar satisfaction in believing, even briefly, that one has reached clarity. It is the same satisfaction that comes when a crossword seems to resolve itself too easily, the clues aligning with a smug neatness that ought to make one suspicious. That was the sensation settling over me as Lewis and I walked back through the cloister toward the master's office that afternoon. A theory had presented itself, clean, convenient, and seductively symmetrical. And like all such theories, it made me uneasy. Evelyn Sorrell, choir director, scholar of modest reputation, dependent on Vale's expertise to bolster her own. A bottle of beta blockers found in her drawer, Lewis's discovery, not mine, though he shared it with the pride of a man who believes he has picked up the scent. Several singers recalling tension between the two women, a missing stanza, a hidden presence on the rehearsal tape. It all gathered into a contour that resembled motive. It was Lewis who said it aloud. If Vale threatened to expose her, sir, her scholarship, her compositional attributions, maybe Sorrell panicked. I told him, perhaps. But the word tasted wrong, like an overly sweet chord in an otherwise austere composition. We stood outside the chapel door for a moment, listening to the muffled murmur of voices inside, two altos rehearsing a psalm. The notes drifted through the wood, slightly sharp, slightly unsure. Lewis asked whether we should speak to Sorrell again. I shook my head. We would, but not yet. A premature confrontation, like a premature answer, had a way of blinding a man to the shape of truth. Instead, I returned to the choir room alone. The chairs remained in their careful disarray, as though still bearing the heat of bodies that had long since moved on. The faint chalk residue on the music stand caught my eye again. It had not been brushed away. Deliberate, or simply another detail dismissed by people who assumed the world contained nothing worth noticing. The cassette recorder sat on the desk. I pressed play. The rehearsal spilled out, thin and wavering, the kind of sound that seemed to remember it had once been music. The final chord arrived. The stray breath lingered. But listening again, I detected something else, an unevenness in the soundscape, a slight shift in the room's resonance. Someone had stood close enough to alter the air itself. I closed my eyes. Sorrell's explanation of her recorder placement had been too smooth, her gestures too practiced. Her fingers trembled when she stopped the tape. A lyre's tremor, or simply the tremor of a woman grieving a colleague she never entirely understood. When I rejoined Lewis, he had found Pym in the corridor, speaking with a student in a tone that suggested the conversation had begun with courtesy and drifted toward reprimand. She turned to us with the impeccable composure she had worn since the moment we met her. She asked whether we had made progress. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes carried the faint sheen of someone calculating what knowledge might already be known. Lewis mentioned the medication. A flicker crossed her face, barely a tremor, but enough to suggest she had not expected us to discover it. She claimed it was her own prescription. "Anxiety," she said softly. She disliked speaking of it. Her calm tone contradicted the sentiment, though it was delivered with enough dignity that one hesitated to distrust it. Yet her explanation fit too neatly into the narrative forming around Sorel, like a puzzle piece carved to match a whole that had never been part of the original picture. When we returned to the quad, Lewis reiterated the theory. "It fits, sir. She had motive, opportunity, medication." Vale confronts her. Tempers rise. A small dose, just enough to push her over. It all lines up. His certainty irked me, not because he was wrong, but because he was almost right. Almost is the most dangerous state in an investigation. I told him that tidy solutions are rarely true ones. He asked what felt wrong. I could not articulate it. Instead, I mentioned the crossword clue Vale had circled. Ending withheld reveals truth. Lewis dismissed it as coincidence. I told him I no longer believed in coincidence, not when the world kept offering clues disguised as irrelevances. As evening approached, the college bell tolled once, a hollow note that echoed through the stone. Something in its resonance unsettled me. The theory about Sorel should have provided closure, or at least direction. Yet I felt only the faint dissonance that arrives when the mind attempts to force an imperfect answer into a perfect shape. A first ending, yes, but too elegant, too complete, and somewhere just beyond reach, a second narrative waited, quiet, patient, and far more dangerous. There are certain texts whose meaning shifts the longer one looks at them, as though the ink itself resists settling. The incomplete hymn on Vale's desk had become such a text for me. I carried it back to the station late that evening, a faint drizzle turning the pavements into blurred mirrors. I spread the sheet on my desk beneath the yellow lamplight, letting its torn edge accuse me with its silence. Lewis asked whether I expected the missing stanza to materialize if I stared hard enough. I told him no, though the truth was more uncertain. There are absences that reveal themselves only when one grows patient with them, and something in the deliberate neatness of the tear troubled me more with each passing hour. The marginalia, Vale's angular hand, had circled a single phrase. "The mourner who walks among the living." The line originated from a medieval hymn Vale had written about in an earlier paper, one Lewis eventually unearthed from the Bodleian's basement archives. When he brought the paper to my desk, damp from the rain, I read it with the reverence of a man reading a confession not directed at him. Vale had argued that the hymn described a figure who existed between states, neither fully present nor entirely absent, a symbolic wanderer carrying a truth too burdensome to declare. Her academic analysis was precise, but there was a faint tension beneath the sentences, as though she had been writing about something more contemporary than her subject. Lewis asked whether Vale had been isolating herself before her death. I told him that scholars often lived at the edge of solitude, but the question pressed itself upon me nonetheless. Had Vale been walking among us, unseen, unheard, bearing a truth she feared would undo her? While Lewis left to recheck the timeline of the bursar's movements, I revisited the unsigned letter we had found. Something in its phrasing had lingered, its clipped tone, its polished severity. I read it again, letting the cadence settle. It reminded me of the way Pym spoke, each sentence trimmed of waste. But Pym's indifference carried a different timbre. The letter felt more like mimicry than authorship, a false register worn by someone trying to appear colder than they were. As I folded the letter, a faint glint near the hymn sheet caught my eye. A thread, barely visible, dark. I pinched it between my fingers. Not fabric from Vale's clothing, too coarse for modern cloth. Gown material or choir robe. Either possibility grew heavier as I held it. The recorder from the rehearsal sat at the edge of my desk. I played the final seconds again, letting the breath and rustle swirl into the room. But something new occurred to me. Not the breath itself, but what preceded it. A tiny scrape, almost metallic, as though something had brushed against the stand. A ring, perhaps, or a clasp. Sorrel didn't wear jewelry. Pym did. A single ring, heavy, gold, decorative without being gaudy. I remembered it catching the light during our interview, a flash that had struck me then only as poor taste for an administrator. I set the ring theory aside for the moment. Conjecture held no authority here. When Lewis returned, he carried a file of financial records, copies of budgetary reports Vale had apparently reviewed in her final weeks. He handed me the pages with an expression that asked a question he did not voice. As I skimmed the figures, a small but persistent discrepancy surfaced. Maintenance costs inflated in irregular intervals. Nothing grand. Just enough to divert attention from more substantial withdrawals. Withdrawals overseen by Pym. Lewis asked if I thought Vale had discovered the fraud. I told him the numbers made the case plausible. But plausibility had become my enemy. Too many answers pretended to fit, and yet the black gown, the disappearance, the gown in the photograph. Pym wearing a robe to mislead the cameras, or mislead me. I looked again at the hymn. Vale's translation of the missing stanza, referenced in her earlier paper, described the mourner unveiling truth after a long vigil. Vale had circled that line 3 times, not for academic emphasis, for urgency. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I wasn't sure, but I knew suddenly and painfully that Vale had been afraid, not for her reputation, but for the college itself. She had uncovered something she could not allow to be buried. As the evening deepened into the kind of quiet that presses itself against one's ribs, I held the torn page again. The missing stanza was no longer merely an absence. It was a warning, torn away to prevent someone else from reading it. And in that silence, I felt the faint outline of truth at last, uneven, incomplete, waiting for the right question to reveal itself. There is a peculiar heaviness that settles on a college when its secrets begin to stir. St. Crispens felt that way when Lewis and I returned the next morning, as though the stone itself carried the tension of people who had lied a little too often and now feared their fictions might collide. I remember thinking that the quad looked smaller than before, as though truth had begun to shrink the space in which it could comfortably hide. Caroline Pym was waiting for us in her office, sitting with the immovable posture of someone determined not to be intimidated. She offered tea. Lewis accepted. I didn't. There was something about her composure, a certain deliberate serenity that irritated me. It was a serenity worn like armor. I found myself studying the ring on her right hand, heavy and gold, the metal catching the winter light with an insistence that felt almost aggressive. She spoke first, asking whether the investigation had taken a new turn. Her tone was polite, but her fingers betrayed her, tapping once against the edge of her folder, a gesture too controlled to be natural. Lewis mentioned the financial discrepancies. She nodded, as though the word discrepancy were an annoyance rather than an accusation. She explained the gaps with unconvincing ease. Clerical delays, misfiled invoices, the usual litany of administrative sins. I told her that Vale had been reviewing those same accounts. She paused. Not long, but long enough to mark the interruption in her composure. She said she had encouraged Vale to leave financial matters to those trained for them. Then she added, in a tone sharpened by memory, that Vale had been difficult, intractable, unwilling to trust authority. Lewis asked if she had spoken to Vale the night of her collapse. Another pause. She claimed she had passed her briefly in the corridor. Nothing more. Her phrase echoed the earlier statement, too neat to be spontaneous. There was something performative about her recollection, the kind of narration that grows smoother with each retelling. When we left the office, Lewis muttered that she was hiding something. I agreed, though not in the way he thought. Pym struck me as a woman who lied only when necessary, and her necessity seemed driven by fear rather than guilt. We crossed the quad toward the old hall. My attention drifted back to the hymn sheet, the missing stanza, the line Vale had circled, the mourner who walks among the living. For days the phrase had shadowed my thoughts like an unresolved note. I found myself repeating it under my breath as we walked. Lewis asked what I was muttering. I told him nothing, but the truth was that the hymn had begun to feel like Vale's final attempt to be heard. Inside the hall, sunlight filtered through stained glass in muted colors, falling across the long wooden tables like fragments of abandoned ideas. I sat while Lewis fetched the master. In the quiet, my eyes drifted to a stack of programs from recent choir performances. One lay open to a page of acknowledgements. Evelyn Sorrell's name appeared beside Vale's, joint editors for a translation of a medieval chant. But the phrasing of the note caught my attention. It described Vale as having provided assistance with secondary sources. Vale's earlier papers suggested far more substantial involvement. Lewis returned with the master, whose nervous cordiality was beginning to fray. He answered our questions in cautious phrases. At one point, he mentioned that Sorrell had been under stress. Vale had found issues in several of her recent publications. He said this as though confessing a sin on behalf of someone else. After the master left, I reread the program note. Something in the alignment of names felt off, like a crossword clue where the definition sits too far from the wordplay. I flipped to Vale's earlier paper in my folder. In it, she had annotated the same chant extensively. Her translation work was unmistakable. Yet in the published version, Sorrell claimed primary credit. Lewis asked whether I believed Sorrell had plagiarized Vale's scholarship. I told him I believed very little at that moment, but the possibility settled into my thoughts with the quiet certainty of a fact waiting for context. Back at the station that evening, I reread the anonymous letter Vale had received. Its clipped tone, its restraint, its anonymous criticism. It mimicked Pym's voice, but not perfectly. Too refined, too literary, more like a choir director attempting administrative bluntness. A second false ending, then. The neat narrative around Pym, fraud, misdirection, the black gown, had almost convinced me. But the truth, I sensed, lay elsewhere. Sorrell, not Pym, had tampered with the manuscript, the missing stanza, the breath on the tape. I poured myself a whiskey and sat in the dim light, listening to the silence settling around me. A second false ending, and still the real one refused to speak. There is a particular stillness that comes over Oxford in the last hours before dawn, when the lamps burn without conviction and the streets feel half erased. It was in that stillness that the final shape of the case settled upon me. Not with triumph, not with revelation, but with the tired clarity of a man who has run out of places where the truth might hide. I returned to St. Crispens alone. Lewis had offered to come, but I told him I needed quiet. The quad lay empty, the stone glistening faintly from the night's mist. The chapel windows glowed with the low hum of early rehearsals. I stood for a moment, listening to the muted voices inside. Soft warm-ups, unhurried vowels. The sound felt almost human enough to be comforting. Evelyn Sorrell emerged from the side door, carrying a folder of sheet music pressed against her chest. She greeted me with a tone that attempted professional calm, but her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. I asked whether we could speak inside. She agreed, though I sensed she already knew what I wished to say. The choir room felt different, in the early light, less haunted, but more fragile. I walked to the piano, resting my fingers lightly against the cool wood. Sorrel stood near the conductor's dais, her shoulders squared, her hands tightly clasped. I remarked that the rehearsal on the tape had always bothered me. She reminded me that I had mentioned that before. I told her this time the breath was not what I cared about. It was the rustle, the weight in the sound, the scrape of fabric not meant to be there. She asked what that proved. Her voice was steady, but her throat tightened on the final word. I told her I believed she had stood near the recorder, not Vale, and that she had followed Vale after the rehearsal, and that she had gone to her under the guise of concern, only to find her no longer willing to remain silent about the theft of her work. Sorrel's fingers dug into the folder. She whispered that Vale had misunderstood, that the paper had been a collaborative effort. I told her the missing stanza said otherwise. Vale had torn it away not to hide her work, but to protect it from being misused. There was a long quiet then, one of those silences that feels like a choice rather than an accident. She admitted that Vale had confronted her. She could not bear the thought of decades of scholarship collapsing. She said this without self-pity, without theatrics, simply as a woman describing the architecture of her own fear. I asked why she had chosen to tamper with the medication. A small dose, just enough to tilt nature in her favor. She looked away, toward the window where the first rays of morning began to stretch across the floor. She said she could not let Vale ruin her, not after everything she had built, not after the years spent convincing herself she deserved the reputation she carried. When she finally met my gaze, her eyes were dull with resignation. She asked whether I would allow her to finish the rehearsal before taking her in. I told her no. It was the only mercy I could not give. Lewis met me at the gate as I escorted her out. He didn't speak. He simply walked beside us, his presence steady, unjudging. Sorrel moved with the slow dignity of someone who understood that her life had already begun to narrow into the shape of consequence. After she was taken away, I wandered back into the choir room. The chairs waited in their neat arc, the sheets of music resting like abandoned letters. On the stand lay a robe, the same dark fabric I'd seen trailing across Radcliffe Square, but as I touched it, I felt the faint residue of chalk, the subtle weight of guilt that had nothing to do with disguises or misdirection. Pym had worn a borrowed gown to obscure her movements, yes. But this one, Sorrel's, held the story Vale had tried to prevent from being buried. I sat at the piano bench and pressed a single key. The note rang out, solitary, unaccompanied. For a moment, I thought of Vale's careful annotations, her solitary scholarship, her final, unfinished translation, the mourner who walks among the living. She had been mourning truth, mourning it long before it died in her hands. As I left the college, the morning bell began to toll. Its sound drifted across the quad with the quiet majesty of something that had survived too many confessions. And in that echo, I felt no victory, only the muted ache of knowing that some truths emerge not because they insist, but because they refuse to stay silent any longer.